So, if you're interested in immigrating to Europe, here is my story about the reasons and the process of immigration. Perhaps, by Russian standards, I wasn't living too badly before emigrating. I had a small business in a regional Russian city and an income of about 1,500 euros per month. In reality, that's not very much, but against the backdrop of the surrounding poverty, at least I was able to provide my family with a minimally acceptable standard of living. Perhaps I would have continued living in Russia if my wife and I hadn't gone to the Czech Republic in 2008. Of course, I had been abroad before, but only to third world countries, for example, Egypt, Turkey, and, well, Romania. I think there's no need to explain that Egypt is very different from the Czech Republic. So, after visiting the Czech Republic, I realized one simple truth. I was living poorly. Actually, even before my trip to Europe, I kind of suspected this, but I didn't know for sure. But now it became obvious. Many people think about immigrating for years. Honestly, I don't understand those weirdos. What's there to think about? You've come to the realization that you need to get out. It's an obvious thing. If you haven't come to that realization, just take a trip somewhere and you'll understand by the second day. For example, to the Czech Republic or to Montenegro. And if you've come to the simple, obvious understanding that you need to leave, then just go. At the very least, give it a try. At least make a plan and start putting it into action. I'll talk about my immigration process below, but for now, let's get back to the question of why people emigrate. I think that everyone who has left has more or less the same reasons for doing so, but I'll share my own thoughts, the logic I followed when I left. The first reason is an insufficient level of income. Many people will say that you can earn money in any country. The main thing is to be active, goal-oriented, and so on. Therefore, income cannot be a reason for immigration. I only partially agree with this way of thinking. Yes, you can earn more than the average person because, let's be honest, most of the people around us have no ambitions and are not particularly hardworking. So an active person will be able to earn more than a lazy one in any city, in any country. That's obvious. But you can't exceed your own limits. You won't be able to earn 100 times more than the average in the country. Yes, it's quite likely that you'll manage to earn 4 or even 6 times more than the regional average. That's actually how it was for me. As I already mentioned, my income was about 1,500 euros, which is roughly 4 times higher than the model salary in my city. But no matter how smart and hardworking you are, you still won't be able to earn 100 times more than the regional average. The moral of this story is, living in Montenegro, an active person can earn much more than living in Ascania or Volgograd, since in Montenegro, the model salary is much higher, unemployment is lower, and the working population is more productive. Living in Germany, an active person can earn more than in Montenegro. And living in the USA, you can earn more than living in Germany. Are you smart and not afraid of hard work? Your income can be several times higher than the regional average. That's the simple conclusion I've come to in my life. Accordingly, by leaving a regional city, you can significantly improve your situation simply because you left. And some people will move to Moscow. I wouldn't say that's a bad decision. And some people will move to Europe. In short, you need to get out of the regions. It's absolutely necessary to leave. It's bad there, and it will always be bad there. Where to go, that's another question, and everyone decides that for themselves. Income level is far from the only reason for immigration. There are other reasons too. For example, relationships between people. It was always hard for me to communicate with my fellow countrymen. I felt it since childhood and up until immigration, but I just didn't understand why before. Now I understand. It's about the people. In Russia, there's something wrong with the way people treat each other. You really feel it when you come back home after a long absence, especially in the regions. It's not like that in Moscow. In Moscow, people are much friendlier. Maybe it depends on the standard of living. I don't know. But in the regions, no one wants to connect. Everyone tries to talk as little as possible about their own life. It's easy to sense envy. When I come to Russia, I don't tell anyone that I live in Montenegro because you never know what kind of reaction you'll get. One time, I answered a phone call in a minibus while I get a lot of work calls, so I just can't ignore them. So I answered and said, I'm abroad right now in roaming. This call is expensive for you, so let's talk a bit later when I'm online. We can connect on WhatsApp or Viber. The whole minibus turned to look at me. Everyone looked at me as if I had just confessed to working for Ukrainian intelligence. In any European country, people wouldn't react at all to a phrase like that. So a foreigner arrived, so what? There are foreigners everywhere here. I don't know how else to explain the difference in people's attitudes. I could give many examples, but if you've never lived abroad, you probably just won't understand me. You have to come, live there, and feel for yourself what the difference is. And the next reason for emigrating might be quite ordinary. Probably many people don't worry about this as much as I did, but I just can't stand watching 76% of the population being thrilled about the right course Russia is taking. By the time I emigrated, I had already been hearing about the coming of a bright future for 30 years, but it never arrived. I understood perfectly well that in my lifetime that bright future would never come. And I'm sure you've all heard the phrase, bloom where you are planted. Well, that's complete nonsense made up by lazy people who can't be bothered to change anything in their lives or to leave. If the place where you were born is bad, and it will stay bad for at least the next 100 years, maybe even 300, then you need to get out of there. It's just basic logic, 1 + 1 = 2. The next reason is the appearance of the cities. But I think there's not even any need to talk about that. Yes, when you come to Moscow, everything is beautiful, everything is lit up, it's all very pleasant. In the regions, the appearance of the cities in most regions, at least is just terrible, absolutely awful. Safety is a very important reason for immigration, for me personally. You know, if someone were to attack me in Montenegro, I would be surprised first, and only then scared. That's a situation that is extremely, extremely unlikely. Yes, in Montenegro, just like in any other country, there is crime, but the number of crimes that are dangerous to others is not just several times, but probably hundreds of times lower than in Russia. Most of the crime there is not dangerous to society. For example, cocaine passes through Montenegro in transit to some European countries. Yes, of course, that's very bad. But this crime poses no threat whatsoever to your life or health. Here, you can walk around safely at any time of day or night. For example, if my wife is coming home late, I don't even think that I need to go pick her up or meet her because something might happen. Nothing can happen here. Minimal stress. Many situations that are very difficult to handle back home are solved very easily in Montenegro. For example, for many years I've used the following example as proof. Closing a company. In Montenegro, closing a company takes about an hour of effort. And how is it back home? Most importantly, in Montenegro there are prospects, but in Russia there are none. The government's economic policy hasn't changed for decades. And the problem actually isn't Putin. Even before Putin, there wasn't a single decent ruler. I love history, and as someone who often reflects on historical topics, I can't recall a single decent ruler in Russia. And there's no guarantee that one will come after Putin. Here's even a small example. When I first came here, the standard of living for Montenegrins was about the same as in Russia. Now, it's already significantly higher. In another 10 years, Russians will not only realize that people in Montenegro live much better, but the standard of living here will simply become unattainable for them. In other words, Russians back home won't even dream of such a life. So Montenegro is developing, there is a future here. But in Russia, there isn't one. But I think that's enough about the reasons for emigration. Let's move on to the process of emigration. As you already know, in 2008, I fell in love with the Czech Republic. For half a year, we prepared to immigrate to the country, saved up money, opened a company there, and took some other steps. But it all ended with the fact that in 2009, the Czech Republic practically stopped issuing residence permits on the basis of opening a company in the country. After joining the EU, the Czech Republic was handing out residence permits left and right. It wasn't much more difficult than before joining the EU. By the way, this raises the question of what will happen in Montenegro when it joins the EU. It doesn't always happen that everything stops immediately after joining the EU. But in 2009, the Czech Republic joined the Schengen area. And at that stage, everything really did come to a halt. In 2009, the Czechs practically stopped issuing residence permits for business purposes. And now many years have passed and they still haven't resumed issuing them. I'm telling all this rather quickly. In reality, things didn't happen so fast. Because by the time we opened the company, by the time we started trying to get a residence permit there in short, it wasn't immediately obvious that the Czechs no longer wanted to see foreigners. By the time this became clear, 2009 was already coming to an end and we began looking for an alternative to the Czech Republic. Back then, in those years, I was still actively working in Russia, providing migration services. I was sending a lot of people to the Czech Republic, and out of the last 30 people, only one person got a visa residence permit. Well, at that point, it just became obvious that trying to immigrate to the Czech Republic was simply pointless. By the way, it was still relatively good back then. Now it's much worse. Now, getting a residence permit in that country is even harder. How do you find the country that you want and are able to immigrate to? Actually, it's very simple. I'll tell you how I did it. Do the same thing. In 2 or 3 hours, or maybe 2 or 3 days, you'll have the full picture and everything will become clear. Take a sheet of paper and write down all the European countries. You can also add any others that you're interested in. Maybe you want to immigrate to Canada, the USA, or somewhere else like Australia. Next to each country, write down their immigration requirements. If you're not a wealthy Buratino, then accordingly, you won't be able to meet the requirements of a large number of countries. you'll see that you simply can't immigrate to most of Europe. So in that case, cross out the countries you can't immigrate to from your list. You'll be left with a small list of countries on your sheet. There will probably be 4, maybe 5 countries, and you choose from those. But this is much more logical, much more practical than spending 7 months on countries you can't immigrate to and banging your head against the closed doors of embassies for 10 years. My choice is narrowed down to Montenegro, Bulgaria, Poland, Serbia, and Slovenia. Well, with Slovenia, after thinking about it a bit, we almost decided to emigrate there. We even had negotiations with some guys who provided migration services, but it turned out that while it's possible to emigrate, it's quite difficult. That is, the main applicant can come right away, but you can only bring your family over after a year. We thought about it and realized we didn't want to be apart for a year, so we gave up on Slovenia. So essentially, the choice came down to 3 countries: Montenegro, Bulgaria, Poland, and Serbia. Out of these countries, I chose Montenegro, and it was absolutely the right decision. What was appealing about Montenegro? Honestly, at the time, I didn't fully understand what was so appealing because there was almost no information about Montenegro. Now, there's my channel, my website. I was the first to start writing and later the first to start making videos about Montenegro. Later, other companies also joined in on this process. Although, of course, they write and write. They don't film as much as I do, but still, they generate some content. When I left in 2011, there was practically no useful material at all. That's how it was. So I didn't understand all the advantages of Montenegro. I even had, since I had never been here on a scouting trip, which I consider to be absolutely the right decision. There's no point for me to go on scouting trips. I'll talk more about that later. I didn't understand all the advantages. And moreover, I had some misconceptions. For example, I thought that here, just like in the Czech Republic, trams run by the minute you come to a tram stop, and the tram leaves at 9:05. At 9:04, you come to the stop, and at 9:05, it departs. I arrived in Montenegro, and not only do trams not run on schedule here, there aren't any trams at all. So I had a few misconceptions like that. But nevertheless, looking back now, I can say the advantages of Montenegro are that it's an incredibly beautiful country, probably the friendliest population in Europe, excellent ecology, immigration programs accessible to everyone, and low cost for maintaining a residence permit, many times cheaper than in other European countries. And most importantly, there is a future here. Back in my homeland, I didn't feel there was a future, but here it exists. The country is developing, people's incomes are growing both for employees and entrepreneurs. And they're growing quite rapidly. For example, if we talk about salaries here are now roughly comparable to those in other European countries higher than in some like Romania and Bulgaria, but lower than in others, for instance, lower than in Slovenia. If the government's plan is implemented now, the plan of the main party, which, as I recall, received about 25 or 26% of the votes in the election, then in principle, I think we will surpass the Czech Republic in terms of living standards. So there you have it. In other words, there is progress. All right, let's get back to Montenegro. So the decision was made. We needed to save money, sell off our belongings, and start considering the possibility of selling our apartment back home. All of this took a lot of time. We didn't leave until 2011. But looking back now, I can say that during the immigration process, we made some serious mistakes even at the planning stage. We planned to save up a certain amount of money, and as it turned out, we actually planned to save much more, specifically 4 times more than we actually needed. In other words, we could have left a year or a year and a half earlier. But now, let's talk about reconnaissance. Yes, before immigrating, we had never been to Montenegro. I think that was the right decision. Many people come, as they say, for a viewing trip. Hand on heart, do you really believe that living in any European country is worse than living in Russia? And if you don't think so, then what's the point of coming to check out that country? You've already listed out European countries on a piece of paper and analyzed their immigration requirements. You can only visit 3 or 4 countries in total, even without any scouting trips. You already know which of these countries is the best, where you want to go most. So why travel around then? It's a different story if you're a rich Buratino who can immigrate to any country in Europe. He travels around Europe to choose which country is better. Yes, for such a wealthy Buratino, scouting trips make sense, but for the vast majority of people, the overwhelming majority of those who come don't have huge amounts of money, not even 99%, but more. For people like that, scouting trips are pointless. Yesterday I received an email with the following content. The letter began with the phrase that the family has a very small budget. A woman writes that she and her husband are going to Montenegro to see it for themselves, to decide whether to immigrate. I have an immediate question. If you have a small budget, then why spend money on a scouting trip? It makes more sense to try to bring as much money as possible to Montenegro rather than spending 4,000 just to go on a scouting trip and maybe make a decision there. And what exactly are you planning to look at? the lack of rudeness in Europe or something like that. But that's just silly. By the way, if we go back a bit, at the very beginning, the start of the story, which I skipped, we were initially considering the question of immigrating from our Musolgorsk to Moscow, St. Petersburg, Kaliningrad, or Krasnodar. But after a short period of reflection, probably about a week, I came to the conclusion that the process of immigrating to Montenegro is at least not more expensive, and in general, actually more reasonable. So that's my story about the reasons for and the process of immigration. You can ask questions in the comments. Goodbye, everyone.